So hello everybody. Thank you for giving me the option to present my results here. This work that I'm going to present is methods of quantifying N-losses at the orchard scale, the work that was done by me and Shahar Baram with other collaborators from UC Davis during my postdoc. And I would like to dedicate this work in loving memory and respect to Professor David Smart, who recently passed and who mentored me through my postdoc. So the structure of my talk, first I'm going to give a short background, then the objectives, methods, and then the results about quantifying and leaching at the orchard scale and upscaling and quantification of emission at the orchard scale, and some summary and thoughts about the idea. So in an ideal world with every crop, we wish to have a nutrient uptake curve like you can see for this one, that for almond that was done by Patrick Brown and his collaborators, where we can actually know how much is consumed by the tree throughout the growing season. Now, once we have this in mind, what we can go is the next step, and we can apply the 4R principles, basically to apply the right nutrient source at the right rate, at the right time, and at the right place. And by that, we can achieve the optimal nutrient uptake. Now, this is all ideal in theory. What happens in reality is that when we go into an orchard, we have big trees, we have small trees, we have high fruit-bearing trees, we have low fruit-bearing trees, and this gives us huge spatial variability and also temporal variability. And the question is, what do we actually do with this spatial variability? How do we monitor it? How can we quantify it? So with that, we said, okay, let's look in an orchard. And you can see this is a typical almond orchard where you have 1 mile over half a mile, and each block is a quarter of a mile by a quarter mile, which basically is the smallest unit that the farmer manages. And what can we learn about this basic operational unit? So our objectives were to find a method that can accurately or representatively estimate fertilizer. When I talk about nitrogen in this talk, losses from the orchard, which is nitrogen is the biggest problem for groundwater contamination and greenhouse gas emissions, and study the effect of different fertigation strategies on nitrogen leakiness as leachates and enteral emissions at the orchard scales. So to do that, the basic hypothesis or the basic idea is we take the inputs, which are basically the fertilizer, the compost, and all other nutrient sources that came into the system. We subtract from it the outputs, basically whatever went out with the yield, the vegetative growth, and so on. And what the difference between these two gives us the losses, basically a mass of how much nitrogen is lost through the orchard every year. So the first thing we had to do in order to estimate it, we said, okay, like they did in many other places, can we monitor a tree, maybe monitor several trees at the orchard, and then see what happens and see if we can learn anything from it. So first was to estimate the rooting depth. The rooting depth of almonds, the active root zone is around, I would say mostly 60 centimeters up to 80 centimeters mainly. But basically whatever goes below 1 meter, we can say would reach the groundwater. So what we did is we used solution samplers as presented here with water content sensors as presented here. So we can monitor the propagation of the waterfront. We have Newton probe access tube, so we could take water content with Newton probes as well. And at the end, what we did is at the depth of 2.9 to 3 meters, we installed an array of 2 tensiometers 20 centimeters apart, so we can get the hydraulic gradient, a solution sampler, and a water content. So this way we could get the retention curve, in situ retention curve, and what is the chemistry of that water. And with that, we can estimate what is the leaching fraction, or how much water and nitrogen is lost below the active root zone annually. And eventually, when you go to the orchard, it looked like that. So you have all the instruments here. You have a logger that logs everything. And this was done for over 3 years. In addition to groundwater monitoring, what we did is we monitored the greenhouse gases, and we wanted to see how does it go along the wetting zone. And you can see with this bluish kind of circle, it was all fungate, basically micro sprinkler irrigation, and at different distances, we placed static chambers And with that, we wanted to monitor the N2O fluxes, the greenhouse gases emissions. We did 3 fertigation strategies, which were basically advanced grower practice, as you can see here, which is AGP and which is most of the orchard, which AGP means that the farmer fertigates the orchard between 3 and 5 times a year. In this specific case, it fertigated 4 times. Pump and fertigate, meaning the same thing, only what we do is we account for the nitrate in the groundwater and we subtract it from the total N load. And high frequency, low N concentration, which basically means we're going to fertigate 20 times throughout the year, or basically each time the water was open, we gave fertilizer. In all experiments, we used UAN32, and PNF and AGFLC, high frequency, low N concentration, basically got same N loads, which AGP got a little higher. They all got the same N loads, more or less at the end of the day. So start with, let's see if it affected yield. And you can see that when we look at yield, the yield, you can see it as the N output in the kernel. You can see a simple mass balance of the input versus output. The bottom line, we get an annual yearly loss if we look in the AGP of around 100 kilograms of N per hectare. And the nitrogen use efficiency is well recognized in the literature, is around 70%, which is very high for orchards. And the AGFLC managed to improve a little bit, but it was without statistical significance. The nitrogen use efficiency and the pump and fertigate, again, we couldn't see a difference in this. You can see in 2015, there was a problem with the PNF. What happened is the groundwater, they changed the groundwater well and the nitrogen concentration dropped down. So we actually ended up giving less than what we planned for. But overall, you can see that the yield, if we compare the yield with the N load, it was not affected by it. So basically, we can say with that, that is as expected and as obviously that it's fair to assume that nitrogen groundwater is equivalent to any nitrate that you add with fertilizer, and as well that 30% of the applied N is lost. Now the question is, can we find that lost? And if we look at the orchard, you can see here there's 2 different orchards. It's an almond orchard and a pistachio orchard. We'll focus on the almond, which is the diamond. You can see huge variability over the season and over the depth, ranging from if 10 is the standard for drinking water, or you can see here the safe drinking water standard. You can see, because this is nitrate, so you can see that many cases are safe and many cases are not safe. So can we say anything about it that is smarter? And if you look, we had 9 monitoring stations. So looking at these stations, you can see the average for a little over 2 years of monitoring. You can see huge variability with the big black squares representing the orchard average. And you can see that on average, if we take the standard for drinking water, which is this red dashed line, you can see that most of the orchard is way above the standard. Some locations are below. So from that point of view, what we can say, okay, if you want to monitor leaching or quantify leakiness by putting a monitoring station in an orchard, it's a hit and miss kind of thing. You might get good results that say, okay, this farmer is doing great, there's no losses, as presented by these reds, or this farmer is doing terrible, as presented by these yellows. So basically what it means is we cannot really put a monitoring station in the orchard and get a good representation of what is going on in that orchard, which is not surprising. We tried to see, using different statistics like principal component analysis and artificial neural network, to try and predict what factor affected the leakiness below, whether there was hard pan, whether there was clay, how long the irrigation, was there flood irrigation, and so on and so forth. And overall, we found very weak correlation and huge errors in predictions using artificial neural network. Basically, we couldn't find one variable that could explain the huge variabilities that we saw in the orchard, as you've seen before. When we tried to look at it with the leakiness, we tried to calculate how much is lost using 5 different methods: one, hydrosimulation; one, calculating the Darcy flux using the neutron probe data, or the Darcy flux using the 5TE data; then mass balance approach with these 2 factors. And you can see over here that we get huge variability. This is based on the mass balance approach, is the red line, and this is the green line, how much is applied. And you can see that there's huge variability over the orchard, but overall, if we look at the average for both years, we can see that the mass balance, which is this line, more or less fits with all our calculated fluxes on average. Basically what we've learned for it, that by using 8 monitoring sites in an orchard, we managed to capture the spatial variability in the orchard. But most importantly is that a simple mass balance can be used instead of expensive, complicated method. Basically, if you know how much fertilizer the farmer applied, you know the yield, you more or less know how much N is used for vegetative growth. So from that, you can say how much is lost into the groundwater annually. If we look at the different fertigation strategies, you can see here the trend over time. Again, the AGP, the PNF, and the HFLC. You can see that in the first year, we had higher concentration. In the first year, fertilizer was applied at the end of the fertigation of the irrigation, which resulted higher losses compared to the second year when fertilizer was applied, which is here. And overall, the AGP had the highest losses. High frequency, low concentration had higher losses than the pump and fertigate. There is still, we're not sure why this is, but it could be due to higher loads of N application at the end of the day. These are just the statistical differences for each fertigation and winter season. You can see that we started with big differences, and at the end of the day, the differences decreased once the fertilizer was applied midday through the irrigation. Now, what about N2O emissions? We looked for a way to upscale it, and what we found is very simple, that the N2O flux, it has direct correlation to basically the relative water application depth, basically the water distribution of the micro sprinkler. So with that, we can basically sum up the fluxes for each wetted radius, and you can define as many as you like. QI is the flux for each one of these sections, pi is just to get the radial, and then the radius for each section. With that, we can calculate the flux over the entire wetted area rather than use one value. And you can see, as expected, you see the 3 different treatments here, and you can see the cumulative emission over the season. Overall, the applied N load was around 100 grams per tree, 1 kilo per tree, roughly. And you can see that overall, the emission factors were very low. You can see that the highest emissions were around March, which first fertilizer application was around March, April, going through June, May and June. And you can see that at the beginning of the season, when the trees are still not very active, even though the soil is still a little colder than as it would be later on down the season, still the fluxes are the highest. And it diminishes throughout the season. Cumulatively, if we look at the cumulative emission, as you can see here, the AGP had the highest, the high frequency, low end, and the pump and fertigate were in between. And basically that's because we decreased the N load. So basically N2O emission were basically a result of the N load that was applied. So if we conclude, N losses occur mainly early in the growing season, when the soil is still wet and fertilizer is applied and the trees are not fully active yet. So that's from February to May. Simple mass balance provides a good proxy of the annual L accumulation in the soil profile at the orchard scale, and basically what would propagate into the groundwater. Despite the huge spatial variability in NO3 concentration, okay, basically we got a fairly good agreement between our monitoring and what is actually based on mass balance. And we can assume that under typical best management practices, the annual N losses are around between 60 to 100 kilogram N per hectare. And N2O emissions is concentration dependent and can be upscaled based on the water distribution pattern of the emitter. Basically, if we want to increase the nitrogen use efficiency, limit N2O emission, we should transition to more applications with lower concentrations. And better knowledge of tree-based variables, fruit loads, ET, etc. are needed in order to get spatial representation of the N-losses, and this is done today with different efforts using remote sensing and so on. I believe that's the next stage. With that, I thank you for your time.